Good morning and welcome for joining with us here today to talk about what we believe to be a very important issue. This was an important issue back at the beginning of session because what it dealt with was a policy that didn't deal or enable victims and their voice to be part of the equation. And this shows you what last year's commutation policies were and how many people had a commutation and then what happened this year. And we found that that result was striking. And so we began to heighten the level of awareness on this issue and ultimately got to the point where even the governor recognized we needed to put a pause on this. A pause to reevaluate and look at the guidelines. He put together a work group between the legislature and the executive that was working on making sure that the victim's voice was at the table. Last week there was an amendment. And as part of that process, there was a new chairman appointed to the commission. And she started to look at new guidelines. Well, last week there was an amendment to a bill in the House that works in, I'm going to say, a different direction than the framework that was laid out. A framework that was put together by the executive and the legislature to make sure that at the heart of this, victims were going to be heard. That's really our primary focus here, is to make sure that the guidelines and our commutation policy takes into account the victims of the crimes for which people were serving time. So we remain dedicated to that purpose as a caucus. We will continue to stand with and fight for victims. And what I'm going to do now is bring up State Senator Heather Summers, who has been our point person on this policy and has done a fantastic job at making sure that the victims are heard and that we get the necessary changes to the guidance under which the Board of Pardons and Parole operates. So with that, Senator Summers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thankfully, very few of us here will be the victim of a crime, but even fewer will be the victim of a violent crime. And of those, only a handful will be a victim of a violent crime that ends up taking a life. For those who are the victims of a crime where they have a loved one who's been killed, murdered, raped, murdered, molested and murdered, whether it be a daughter, a son, a father, a friend, a colleague, they have been handed a lifetime sentence that can include trauma, extreme loss, despair. And let me be clear, the victims in these cases do not get a second chance. So unfortunately, we are here today to talk about this once again. You have all heard from our leader, Senator Kelly, on how we got here. And we had all had a press conference earlier about the policy crafted by the Board of Pardon and Paroles, as we said, in the cloak of darkness, where the policy changed, where all of a sudden we had 44 people who had committed murder have their sentence commuted. When we brought that to light, there was a conversation, an opening for a discussion on what that policy should look like here in the state of Connecticut. We were promised an open conversation, a roundtable conversation where victims, legislators, the Judiciary Committee would have input on what the policy looked like. And as you heard, even the Governor Lamont, found the actions of the board questionable to such a degree that he replaced Mr. Giles, the former chairman, with a new woman who had been part of the Board of Pardon and Paroles, but who had not been involved in the commutations. She is qualified, she's competent, and she was willing to take on this challenge right away. Immediately, she halted all commutations until we could have the conversation that was promised. I personally met with her, along with victims, for hours, discussing what the policy should look like, what victims wanted, how we could change it, while balancing those who had committed lesser crimes, those who had been sentenced at a young age, versus those who could potentially pose a risk to society, all along with the feelings and the victimization of the families left behind. But unfortunately, history seems to be repeating itself. Last week, an amendment came out of the House without our Senate being involved, an amendment that absolutely disregarded everything the new chair had proposed. It was absolutely dismissed. There was an email from that new chair pleading with the folks putting in the amendment, please include these things that we have discussed, and it was completely dismissed and ignored. So I have to say, did the governor appoint a new woman chair just for show? Or are we really going to change the policy here on the Board of Pardon and Paroles? If we are going to take at face value what has happened out of the House, we are clearly just creating an illusion of doing something here in the state of Connecticut to fix the commutation policy, because we're not. And in fact, if this policy moves forward, it is now going to be law. So what we have done is codified, or we will be doing, is codifying the eligibility criteria that we all rallied against under the Board of Pardon and Paroles into law. In essence, tying the new chair's hands without an opportunity for her to weigh in, to do her job, to have an open and public conversation with a public hearing on what commutations should look like here in the state of Connecticut. So I want to point out a few things. You can see from the boards here some of the differences in the current Board of Pardon and Paroles eligibility, and also the amendment and what the chair had requested in writing. But in addition to the eligibility criteria, there are some important points that cannot be missed. The first one is if a prisoner applies for, puts in an application for a commutation, currently victims are notified. Because if you are the victim of a crime like this, you want to know every single thing that person in prison who took your family member's life does. It was clear from the victims speaking previously, the one thing they wanted is notification. This amendment strips away the notification of victims when someone applies for a commutation. So there is no victim notification. Secondly, if that application is approved and the victim and the perpetrator goes to a hearing for a commutation, currently families can go to the hearing, they can write a statement, they can speak as to why that person should not get a commutation, or they could speak to why the person should get a commutation. This amendment strips that. What it says is the victim, if the victim can be located, the attorney or a victim's advocate has the ability to appear at that hearing. But for a family member, they will now have to get permission to go in front of the Board of Pardon and Paroles to talk about why the person who killed their loved one should or should not get a commutation. So let me paint a picture for you. With me today, I have John Aberg. His grandson was molested and then beaten to death with a baseball bat. So, if the perpetrator is granted a hearing, what would happen? First of all, John and his wife Marta would not be notified. Then when the hearing comes up, the victim, we know where he is. He's dead. We know where he's located. His ashes are in John's house. So either an attorney or a victim's advocate would have to speak for them. The grandparents of the murdered 3-year-old child would not be able to attend a hearing unless they received permission from the chair. Can you think of anything more egregious? That you cannot attend a hearing to let out the person who killed your 3-year-old grandson without permission? That flies in the face of victims' rights here in the state of Connecticut. And the last thing I want to point out is something that's very important. Currently, under our commutation policy, a person who is incarcerated can be applying for sentence modification in front of judges and a commutation at the same time. It is not uncommon to have a group of judges say no to sentence modification. These are judges that are trained. They look at all the factors that go into the sentencing, and then a week later, that person is granted a commutation by our Board of Pardon and Paroles. One of the most key elements, I believe, that the new chair requested is that someone who's incarcerated must absolutely expire all their sentence modification hearings before they apply for a commutation. And that makes sense, and it is critical that people understand that. So in summary, I want to say that this amendment that passed out of the House sets victims back. It disregards their input. It brings a policy for eligibility that was rallied against here, and it codifies it in statute, should that pass, and it must stop. I believe that we all believe in redemption. We all believe in atonement, and we believe in justice. But with that, there has to be the belief that there is peace for the victims in those circumstances. And this bill is anything but that. So I would now like to introduce John Aberg, who is the gentleman that I just spoke about, to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Summers. And thank you, Senators Kissel and Kelly and Harding, for your support here. You've been doing yeoman's work for months now on this issue, and the struggle continues. My name is John Aberg. Okay, thank you. My name is John Aberg. I am here because we had a murder in my family 16 years ago, and I'm very concerned about the way the commutation process is being handled and how the amendments to this bill are not helping victims' voices. Victims' voices matter in this process. The family members of homicide victims are being left out by this bill. That is in conflict with Connecticut victims' rights, and specifically in existing statute, section 54-130D, which I have a copy of and I'd be happy to show you, that explicitly allows family involvement. This bill, as it stands, does not. If I can say quite frankly, this bill is a mess. When I read through it, it looked like a second draft. Just a quick read-through showed many inconsistencies and conflicts. For example, line 328, and I'd be happy to show this to you. Line 328 says that victim services must be notified within 90 days of a hearing. Down at line 525, it says they're to be notified not less than 30 days. So that's a big difference. 90 days, 30 days, which one is it? Either way, it would be much better than the 5 days that the Carlson family was given earlier this year. But these are the sort of inconsistencies that are, it's kind of shocking to look through this document and see what a pretty basic read-through and proofreading should have caught. Most people have not been victims of crime, as Senator Summers just mentioned, and that's a good thing. Most people, and fewer people, have been victims of violent crime. But for those who have, their input matters. For them, this bill looks very different than it would to others. It is an undermining of the victims' rights. It's an undermining of their murdered loved ones' rights. So we're asking that the legislators can step back to rework portions of this bill to maintain and hopefully to strengthen the rights of the victims of crime. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now it's my honor to introduce Senator John Kissel, who is a Chief Deputy Leader and also our ranking member on Judiciary.
Thank you, Heather, Senator Kelly, my colleagues from the Senate Republican Caucus, and the victims and victims' families that are gathered here. A few months ago, we had a press conference as Senate Republicans led by Senator Summers because victims in her constituency notified her about what was going on regarding the commutation process of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. Frankly, I was amazed when I found out what was transpiring. We were not informed, and I would have thought that I would have been informed as the ranking senator on the Judiciary Committee, ranking on that committee for nearly 2 decades. In response to that, I want to commend Governor Lamont. He heard our cries and the concerns raised by the victims and their families, and he changed the chair from Carlton Giles to Jennifer Zaccanini, a woman who has taken on this new responsibility. She's been on the Board of Pardons and Paroles for about 15 years, and she wasn't afraid to change the policy direction. We gathered together, Democrats and Republicans from the Judiciary Committee with representatives of Governor Lamont, and we had a meeting, and they wanted to study the policy and what we could do legislatively. We said we'd meet again in 2 weeks, and yet, unfortunately, for whatever reason, we never came back and met. Now, a week ago, my colleagues, with the best of intentions, I'm sure, passed an amendment onto a judiciary bill in the House, essentially codifying eligibility requirements for people that want commutation. And just to take a step back, commutation doesn't mean the doors to prison are open, but it does mean that the time given after a trial or a plea negotiation is shaved off. And on average, if it's a murder, it's like 15 years. That may result in the person immediately being released or a very short window until they are. So this is a major policy impact on how criminal justice is sought and attained in Connecticut. When we saw the bill that came from the House, we said to ourselves, this is not appropriate, this is not adequate, and this does a disservice to the victims and their families. I believe Jennifer Zaccanini is a good pick, and I commend Governor Lamont for selecting her. She wanted some changes in the bill. She did not get them. I've had representatives of the judicial branch reach out to me seeking changes in the bill. They did not get them. It's my understanding that the bill doesn't even allow the Office of the Victim Advocate to participate in commutation hearings. We have a victims' rights amendment in our state constitution. They are protected by our state constitution. So I believe, just personally, I can't speak for my Senate Republican colleagues, that we would be better served if we had no bill this year and let Chairwoman Zaccanini do her work, because the bill as handed up to us from the House actually takes a step back. The other thing that that bill does is it takes the appointing authority away from Governor Lamont and puts it with the legislature. That misses the point. That really is second fiddle to the overarching issue as to how do we treat victims, their families, their loved ones. That is our primary concern. So we that are standing here before you, both Senate Republicans, like-minded legislators, and the victims and their families, we are going to amend that bill and discuss it till the cows come home. Last I heard, we have 41 amendments to that bill, and if the bill runs out of steam and doesn't pass this year, I have the utmost confidence in Jennifer Zaccanini to make good decisions that respect victims and victims' rights. So I commend Senator Summers and Senator Kelly for their leadership on this issue. We owe it to the victims and their families to do a lot better, and we are committed to do so. Thank you.
I would now like to introduce Senator Steve Harding.
Thank you, Senator Summers. I just want to echo what Senator Kissel had said. Thank you to him, Senator Summers, Senator Kelly, and of course these incredible families that we have behind us here today for their advocacy against the policies to your left there that led from 3 commutations in a period of 4 years to 71 in just 1 year. This is about what direction our state is going to lead, where we stand on this critical issue. This is what this is about, where the governor's office stands on this critical issue. Do we stand with the victims' families and the victims who are asking for reasonable things like notice, reasonable things like saying an individual has to serve at least 50% of their sentence before they can get a full parole or pardon? Do we want to stand for reasonable steps and stand behind these victims and stand behind these victims' families, or do we want to stand behind the criminals that have been convicted of heinous crimes? Where do we stand on this issue? Senator Kissel made a very important point. Our state, in our state constitution, has already placed an amendment that codifies victims' rights. We've made it clear where we should be standing on this issue. I would argue that the policy that was passed last week is antithetical to victims' rights and victims' families' rights. We have an obligation as a legislature in the Senate, and I know with my colleagues we'll be fighting this hard, to pass a good, comprehensive plan that truly reflects what the governor's office had previously said regarding this policy right here. And I would ask the governor's office, where do you stand on this issue? Was the replacement of the chairman simply for show, or do you actually mean something by it substantively? Because by what was passed and by the lack of listening to what the chairman currently wants, I would argue that it's just for show. And if that's the case, that's wrong, and we as a Senate body should stand hard against it, and we will be. Thank you.
Our next speaker today is going to be Cornell Lewis.
My name is Cornell Lewis. I am here today in support of survivors of homicide. A quote from Dante's Inferno goes like this: "Let us not speak of them, but look and pass on." There are people that are seeking to get out of jail for murder that have taken treasures from people. They have taken their loved ones, they have taken their spouses and their children. And if my memory serves me correctly, in 2022, 44 people were commuted out of 71 that were requested, I believe, and the 44 were in for murder. Murder is calculated, it's planned, and is carried out in a horrific fashion. The people who are survivors of homicide need to be informed of what is going on. There needs to be a transparent process, and most of all, they need to be included in this process. As I said, what do we have to say about people that murder and want to get out before the time? Well, Dante said it far better than I. Let us not speak of them, but look and pass on.
Our next speaker is Bruce Carlson, followed by Jan Kritzman.
Good afternoon. 21 years ago, our daughter Elizabeth was murdered by inmate 300990. He was sentenced to 42 years. Our goal is to make sure he serves the entire 42 years. I commend Jennifer Zaccanini for being appointed as chairwoman of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. On April 26th, my family met with her and her lawyer on a Zoom meeting for almost an hour. I found her to be very considerate, very thoughtful. She had a bunch of ideas on how to change these policies. Most I agreed with, some I didn't agree with, but you know, that's the way it works. She worked very hard to come up with changes that would hopefully work for everyone. She sent them to the legislature. Unfortunately, she was thrown under the bus, and that went away. I'd like to remind everybody that for somebody that commits a major crime, there are at least 4 ways to get out of jail. 1, serve the entire sentence. 2, become eligible for parole if the judge grants that. The third way should be a sentence reduction hearing, which is not part of the executive branch, BOPP. It goes back to the court, and the court essentially redoes the sentencing portion of the trial. One of her key recommendations was that anybody that wants to be considered for commutation must go through a sentence reduction hearing first to a full judgment. Commutation should not be a way for mass exits, as we saw over there. Of the 71, 44 of them were murders. That's rather significant. The bill that was put together, when we talk about victims' rights, first thing is, what we went through was we started with a pre-screen hearing. And a lot of inmates don't make it through the pre-screen hearing. That has been eliminated. It's now it's an administrative review, which is not a hearing, so we don't need to be invited. They sort of figured out a way to skip that step. In the new amendment, page 21, line 339, it states, the following persons may appear in person or using audio or video connections before a commutations panel during a hearing pursuant to this subsection. A, the applicant, obviously. B, the applicant's attorney. C, any victim of a crime for which the board is considering a commutation. Or if the victim cannot be located, a representative of the Office of the Victim Advocate. I don't know who dreamed this up. It must have been 2 in the morning when they were high on 500 cups of coffee. Victims of murder and manslaughter cannot appear at a hearing because they are dead. And we know where they are. They're either in the ground or in inert. I don't know who dreamed all this up, but it's a major step backwards. Thank you.
We're now going to hear from Jan Kritzman.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Jan Kritzman. I'm here with the Carlson family, my very dearest friends from a lifetime, whose daughter Elizabeth was murdered on May 22nd, 2002. We are the survivors of homicide. I'm very distressed that House Bill 6738 provides nothing to include the survivors of the victims who are no longer here. We are their only voice. In the case of a homicide, where a murderer has taken a plea deal, in our case, 42 years no parole plea deal, which already included a reduction in the length of their sentence, don't we have the right to be notified as soon as our murderer is asking for sentencing commutation? Shouldn't we have the right to attend all hearings by at least electronic media? In this bill, having someone from the Office of Victims Advocate attending any hearings is not good enough, because we are the victim's only true advocate. We are the only ones who know the details of this horrific crime. We must be allowed to be there, too, throughout the entire process, from beginning to end. We cannot be disregarded. Remember, we are serving a sentence also, and that sentence is a lifetime without our Elizabeth Carlson. Remember, we will never be entitled to so-called sentencing commutation, will we? We are the survivors of homicide. Where is our sentencing commutation? There is none.
We are now going to hear from Linda Binnecade, who is from the Survivors of Homicide.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Linda Binnecade, Binnennkade. I stand before you today as a survivor of homicide. I am the only voice the true victims have, Barry, Bobby, and Lauren, who were brutally murdered 20 years ago. They deserve a voice. Sadly, I was here a month ago where we thought we made progress and we had the commutation policy repealed, if you will. The governor assigned a new chairman, but sadly, here I am again today because again, we're trying to go through the back door and pass policy without the public's knowledge. Representative Fishman and Senator Staffstrom have taken it upon themselves, just as Charlton Giles did, to create amendments to Bill 6738 that take away our rights as victims' families, that take away the rights we have under the Constitution of Connecticut, where once we were a victims advocate state, we are now a bleeding heart state for criminals. It's disgusting. This bill and the amendments they are trying to pass, again, are being done in a vacuum. The governor committed to us that there would be a collaborative process with the new chairman of the Board of Pardons and Paroles and the Judiciary Committee and victims' families, where we could collaboratively come up with a policy that is fair and equitable. We as survivors of homicide believe, as many do, that many criminals have the ability to be rehabilitated and be restored back to the community, not murderers. They intentionally take the life of outstanding citizens. Barry, Bobby, and Lauren were contributing members of society. They had a very viable business that they ran. They paid their taxes. They donated to their community. Where's your bleeding hearts for them? We're not going to stand here and let this pass again through the back door. We asked the governor today, did you mean it when you said there'd be a collaborative process and you would meet with us as the victim's family to understand? I know the new chairman that you appointed has done that. She's taken the time to meet with victims, to listen to victims, to understand what changes need to be made. And these amendments that are trying to be put through take her power away, take the collaborative process away. What are we doing? It's simple, isn't it? Why are we letting murderers out of prison? What is it that is getting benefited from that? There's restorative justice, but not from murderers. They intentionally took a life. So today I asked the governor, did you mean it when you said you were going to meet with us? When you said you were going to give Jennifer Zaccarini the power and the time to come up with a policy that's fair and just? You're abandoning the victims. Are you abandoning us? Because we live with this every day. Are you, Governor? Is that your intention? Is these amendments being done on your order? Or do we have rogue senators and representatives trying to pass this through? Are you aware, Governor? It's simple. Remove murderers. Let Jennifer Zaccarini do her new job. Was it an illusion? Was it a smokescreen to stop us, to shut us up? She needs the time, the space, and the collaboration with the Judiciary Committee, with the victims' families to come up with a just policy. Today, I want you to know we're not going away. As survivors, we have learned to persevere, to be persistent, to be patient, and we'll stay here until we get the job done and get it done right. Thank you.
Thank you to all the families who spoke. I think it's clear from what you've heard this morning that victims have rights, whether it's grounded in our state constitution or from the perspective of basic human dignity. As a government, we must listen to the voices of the victims. That's what we started this session. We raised the level of awareness. We created a framework with the executive branch. The executive appointed a new chairperson, and we don't believe it is anything but exercising abundant reasonableness to allow that chairperson, Jennifer Zaccanini, to be given the opportunity to do her job. So with that, we'll take any questions. Last I heard, we have at least 41. At least 41. And yes, this issue is that important. And we are going to continue to stand next to and with victims and their advocates and their families and do what's necessary to make sure the state of Connecticut gets this right. Yes, if this bill gets called in the Senate, we have at least 41 amendments that we are prepared to run. We haven't had any of those discussions, mindful of the Memorial Day weekend. We were doing, honoring our fallen servicemen and women.
Yes, it caught me by surprise. We had a meeting with the governor's folks, the governor's attorney. It was really productive, and Ms. Zaccanini was there. Representatives of victims were there, and Representative Staffstrom, Representative Fishbein, my colleague Senator Winfield. And so at that point in time, the plan was to have counsel for the Board of Pardons and Paroles draft up some suggestions and then share them with the rest of the working group. And my recollection, and I had Melanie Dykes, my staff attorney, there with us as well, and she took down notes. We were going to meet again in 2 weeks. 2 weeks went by, 3 weeks went by, I didn't really hear anything, and we had all the business here in the legislature. Next thing you know, I've gotten a notice from folks in the Board of Pardons and Paroles as well as the judicial branch saying they saw a draft of a proposed amendment to a bill that was going to run in the House the very next day. This was probably the afternoon of the day before. So I reached out and I said to, I reached out to my colleagues in the House, Representative Staffstrom and Representative Fishbein. Representative Staffstrom, the House chair, responded back saying, we're waiting on Legislative Commissioner's office for the penultimate draft. We will share it with you when we get it. That was the first I knew that they were going to do that. That evening, I got a draft, and they were going to run it the next day. And did I want to co-sign it? And I said, for obvious reasons, no. So we weren't really brought in, but that's in the past. I don't take umbrage at that. But it really wasn't as collaborative as it should have been, as it could have been, and as the victims and their families deserve. And so yes, at this point in time, I feel that no bill is better than this bill. And certainly I wasn't looking to try to supplant the governor's authority in appointing the chair. And I really like Jennifer Zaccanini and the direction she's going. So we have 41 amendments and running. And if we have to run out the clock, we will. Thank you.
I wasn't present in the House and don't really know what the conversation was at the time. I'm just looking at what's going to happen or not in the Senate, and that's our focus for today. Well, unfortunately, we have to look at this as a total package because it was put together. I think if we had the opportunity to draft it, we would have drafted it differently, but we're dealing with a bill that's before us And when you look at the entirety of the bill, I think it's very difficult to not stand with the victims in this instance. And that's where we're going to be, because I think victims, under the Constitution have rights that must be protected, both from a legal and a human viewpoint. The entire bill is coming to the Senate as amended. Yeah, I think if the bill came clean without an amendment, we'd have a totally different viewpoint on the compassionate care and emergency circumstances. Unfortunately, that is not what is going to be before the Senate. And when the amendment changed the makeup of the bill, it did so in such a fundamental way. And when you look at the fact that the victim's voice isn't going to be heard during a commutation, you got to look at and weigh the importance and advantages and disadvantages of a bill. And we believe it's so important and critical for victims to have a voice that we're falling down on that side. Or standing up on that side, I really should say. I think we're all set. Thank you.